Welcome to the Lend Academy podcast, episode number 107. This is your host, Peter Renton, co-founder of Lend and founder of Lend Academy. Today on the show, we are talking all about blockchain. I'm delighted to welcome Alex Tapscott, who has literally written the book on blockchain. He is the co-author, along with his father, Don Tapscott, of Blockchain Revolution, How the Technology Behind Bitcoin is Changing Money, Business, and the World. Now, it's a fascinating read, and it really is amazing to me how far blockchain has come in a very short time. So I wanted to get Alex on the show to really talk about, well, firstly, what blockchain is, why it's important, and how, in particular, it's impacting financial services. We go into that in some detail, and Alex provides a couple of excellent examples on that. And we talk about the blockchain consortia that are emerging, and we focus on what really are some of the barriers and the challenges that can hold this adoption back. It really was a fascinating interview. I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so why don't we get started by giving the listeners a little bit of background about yourself and just sort of how you came to where you are in your career today.
Sure. So my roots to blockchain and cryptocurrencies is been circuitous, and I think that's probably true of a lot of people in this industry. I started my career in investment banking, working in Toronto and New York, right out of university, and in that role was spending a lot of my time focused on technology companies and eventually fintech companies when they became more mature and actually came into their own a little bit. And it was in that role in, call it 2013, 2014, that I began to pay attention to what was going on in the world of Bitcoin. This is well before blockchain entered the vernacular, so to speak. And, it was a new asset class and something that I thought was kind of fascinating, and spent some time reading up on it, read the white paper, started trading a little bit of the cryptocurrency, and just became more and more interested by it. Around the same time, quite coincidentally and conveniently, my father, Don Tapscott, was leading a major research initiative at the University of Toronto. And over a steak and a bottle of wine, he and I were discussing, what's new, what's hot. And we got to talking about Bitcoin. And he basically asked, this looks like an interesting technology. Would you want to write a report for this project that I'm conducting? And I basically said, sure, sounds great. So that was in February of 2014, and spent the better part of the summer while I was still working in investment banking, writing this report. And that led to other projects which we did together, which eventually led to us collaborating more profoundly on the book Blockchain Revolution, which was released in May of 2015. Quite well-timed, as right around the time that I think a lot of people in the world were really starting to pay attention to what this technology really meant, and right around the time, too, that many of the predictions that we had been making were beginning to come true. Mm-hmm. And over the past year and a half, that's obviously accelerated quite a bit.
Right. And so then you have a company, Northwest Passage Ventures. What does that actually do?
So around the time that we were writing the book, I began interviewing lots of different companies that were trying to use this technology to solve really big business problems in many different industries, everything from financial services to energy to media and creative industries to even government and public service. And while they had a lot of enthusiasm and great technical knowledge, what they lacked was experience in many respects, dealing with large corporations, dealing with investors. And so I found a niche essentially to work with those companies and to help steward them through a lot of those big decisions that they had to make. That was also a function more of my own time, because when you release a book, you end up spending a lot of your time on the road. Mm-hmm. Over the past 9 months, I visited 15 different countries and given 85 talks.
Wow!
So every single continent except Antarctica and Africa. So when you're in that kind of a role, demanding so much of your time, really the only thing you can do, aside from that, from a business capacity, is work as an advisor. So I was doing a lot of advisory work for those kinds of companies. But at the same time, Don and I, so my co-author and father and I, launched a project called the Blockchain Research Institute, which is a multi-million-dollar think tank that is doing the definitive investigation into blockchain strategies for big businesses and the enterprise. So we count as our members companies like IBM, Accenture, NASDAQ, Pepsi, FedEx, Thomson Reuters, Tencent, and about a couple dozen others. And the goal of that project is to provide clarity and provide expertise for business leaders in the C-suite who have to make really big decisions about how to use this technology, when to use this technology, and what it actually means for their enterprise. And then the final thing that I do is now that the book marketing has kind of died down a little bit, I'm going to focus my attention on the project that I've been most passionate about the whole time, which is to invest directly into this ecosystem. So I'm launching an investment company that will deploy capital, making decisions both in traditional venture capital, private equity opportunities, and also in the crypto asset space itself. So for the people who are listening to this podcast, they may not be aware that there's more to this world than Bitcoin or even Bitcoin and Ethereum. And in aggregate, the whole universe of opportunities is over $110 billion in size, and it's growing exponentially. And there's really a dearth of professional portfolio management in that part of the marketplace. And so that's an opportunity we see for us and one that we think we can fill.
Sure. I imagine so. So let's just back up a little bit, because I know that there's going to be listeners to the show that don't really know much about blockchain. Obviously, most people and pretty much everyone in business, I imagine, has heard of it by now, but most people might just equate it to Bitcoin. So why don't you just give the listeners your definition of what the blockchain actually is?
Yeah, well, they might be wondering why I would quit a comfortable life as an investment banker to pursue this crazy, wild, and brand new industry, and what excites me about it, right?
Right.
And that's quite simply that I think this technology represents the second generation of the internet. For 30 years or so, we've had the internet of information, and it's been a great tool for changing how we communicate and how we access information, but it hasn't had as big an impact on the world of business and on the economy, I think, as a lot of people thought when it originally debuted. And that's for a very simple reason, which is that it's designed for moving information, not value. So when you send an email, you can send the same email to someone else, or you can send the same email to a million other people. So that's great for an email, but imagine that email was $20. If you send $20 to someone, it's pretty important that that person knows that they have it and you don't. So it's like having a printing press for information, which is good, but when it comes to money, we don't want to be giving everybody a printing press, because that would make the money worthless. So as a result, even with the first generation of the internet, we still had to rely on intermediaries. So banks, governments, PayPal, Visa, but also big social media companies like Google, Facebook, digital conglomerates like Amazon and Apple, to sit in the middle of transactions and perform a whole bunch of really important roles. Everything from validating the identity of parties, to creating trust, to performing the transaction and business logic, so clearing and settling, to record keeping. And because of the proliferation of the internet, a lot of the value that's been created has actually been captured asymmetrically by those intermediaries. So with blockchain, the internet's entering a second era, from an internet of information to an internet of value. And it's based on this technology, which is simple in what it is, but profound in its implications. A blockchain is basically a distributed public ledger of transactions. It originated with the Bitcoin blockchain, but since has spawned a whole ecosystem of new technologies. And on this platform, not just information, but anything of value. So money, financial assets, stocks and bonds, titles and deeds, IP, even votes in an election can be moved, stored, and managed securely and privately and peer-to-peer, which is the key innovation. Not with an intermediary creating trust, but rather a network creating trust through a combination of collaboration, cryptography, and some clever code. And it's quite a profound what has happened over the few years that this technology has been around. It started with Bitcoin, but it's since spread like wildfire and basically captured the imagination of technologists, certainly, but also business leaders, government leaders, people in civil society, journalists, the media, you name it.
Right. Okay. So I get that. Certainly, and it's great that we have an example that is pretty widespread with Bitcoin out there. But it seems to me, and I know you go through this in your book in some detail, but it seems to me it's quite a leap from saying, well, anything of value, it can move value around. But how do you go from that statement to saying it's the second generation of the internet? Because that is, the internet is obviously very well established. You can get internet access in pretty much every country in the world, and it feels like such an established utility right now. So how do you go from just, from moving value around to being the actual second generation of the internet?
Well, it's a great point. And quite honestly, if you had asked someone in 1993 to predict what they thought the internet could do, they might not be completely correct. They might not know about the pervasiveness of the mobile web or geolocation or cloud computing or social media or the interaction of the internet and the Internet of Things and these other innovations. It's hard to predict what's going to happen 20, 30 years down the road. And we always say we're not in the prediction business because the future is not something to be predicted, it's something to be achieved. I think a lot of people forget that the first email was sent in 1969. And the internet didn't get commercialized until 25 years later.
Right.
And it's been 25 years almost since then. And now we're beginning to, see the internet as this ubiquitous technology that's having a really profound impact on all of our lives. Bitcoin and blockchain technology is 8 years old, really about 5 years in earnest since it ever became more widely used, more than just, a science experiment that was bouncing around discussion forums and things like that. And so I think that the rate of change that we've actually seen in this ecosystem has been faster than any we've seen in the past. In the book, we said that within 5 years of when we wrote it, that the world of venture capital would be unrecognizable because blockchain technology allowed companies, entrepreneurs anywhere, to issue tokens that represented the value in the project they were building to a massive global network, peer-to-peer, without the need for brokers and agents and clearinghouses and escrow agents and lawyers and the like. And we were wrong in that prediction because it ended up happening in 1 year, not in 5 years. And today, the vast majority of companies that operate in the so-called blockchain industry raise money this way. They don't go knocking on doors in Sand Hill Row in Silicon Valley. They do these crowd sales, which have been dubbed recently ICOs, initial coin offerings. And the amount of money that they've raised is quite staggering. In the first half of this year alone, it's been over $500 million, which far outstrips any traditional VC investment that's been made over that same period of time. So when we talk about, you mentioned Bitcoin as the first example, and it's certainly true. But now we're talking about tokens that represent everything from loyalty points to digital cloud storage to API keys that allow developers to program something on top of the platform to even attention. And this is just a fascinating example. There was a company called Brave that did one of these crowd sales, and they sold a token called a basic attention token. And essentially the way it works is that the token is applied to content that ends up paying the creator directly. And it's financed by advertisers that want to run content on top of, or want to run ads on top of content. So what that means in effect is we now have a monetization system for making sure content creators get paid fairly on the internet and making sure that advertisers don't spam users. And that company raised $30 million selling this native token in 30 seconds. So things are happening much faster actually than we thought they would. So I agree. I mean, I would never say that this is a mature industry. I'd say that we're probably, halfway through the first inning of the first game of a 7-game series, to use a baseball analogy.
Okay.
I don't know what the analogy is in cricket or anything else, but it's still very early. It's still pretty early here, and already we're seeing this have a pretty big impact, which is really exciting and encouraging for us because it validates a lot of what we said in the book.
Right. And that's, I know these initial coin offerings of, I feel like I read about a new one almost every day, it feels like now. And I know there was one recently, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I was listening to a podcast recently about that mentioned it, that a company, I think it was a company just instead of going out to the venture community they just raised money as if they would from a venture or an angel investment community. I think they raised like $10 million, and it was all just done through this token that now has value, and it is fascinating. I can see, we could talk about that for the whole rest of the show, but I do want to get on to some other things. I could see though it's really, it has the potential, particularly, raising money is one way that I could see how, like the Jobs Act has tried very hard to democratize the raising of capital, but it hasn't really succeeded. And I could see something like this has probably more potential in the long run.
Well, just one point on that. I do think there's a lot to cover here, but this is pretty interesting. So just because there's a new funding mechanism, which has transformed venture capital, doesn't mean that the venture is getting financed or any good. That's point number one. Right. It doesn't mean that they're bad. What it means is that a lot of these companies or projects, however you want to define them, will probably succeed at the same rate that most normal early stage companies succeed, which is to say not often, right? So maybe 6 or 7 out of 10 will not work out, and maybe 1 or 2 will perform okay, and maybe 1 will do very well. But it's out of this new funding mechanism that the next Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple will emerge. And they won't be private. They might not be private companies like those ones I just named. They could be a new type of organization. But the most valuable things that will come out of, or rather the most valuable organizations of the next era of the internet will come out of this process. And then the second point is that a lot of this is happening in a legal gray zone, regulatory gray zone. Right. And I think there's going to be a reckoning at some point where we need to reconcile, what's going on, which I think on balance is very good, with the fact that there are laws and they must be respected. And those are questions that we'll have to wait for another day and maybe another podcast.
Right.
Ask me in here.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I want to get back to a little bit more of just some of the details here about blockchain. I know we've got, Ethereum has been receiving a lot of press right now, and I think it was a Canadian that actually started Ethereum. But most people understand now what Bitcoin is, and Ethereum was sort of created, what I've read, in response to some of the shortcomings of Bitcoin. And can you explain what those shortcomings were and what really is the big difference with Ethereum?
Sure. So from its very start, Bitcoin was designed to be a single-purpose technology. It was designed to be a way to move value in Bitcoin peer-to-peer, in the same way that you might move value in cash peer-to-peer by handing someone a $5 note. So there wasn't anything like this that had existed before, cash for the internet. And what was amazing about it is that it worked, right? But it was never designed to handle more than just Bitcoin. And a lot of developers have been trying really hard to not reprogram it, but to make it work for other kinds of assets. And the person who you're referring to, his name is Vitalik Buterin, and he was big in the Bitcoin community, but saw these limitations. He thought the technology could be used for more than just moving Bitcoin. He thought it could be used to move lots of different kinds of assets, and maybe even to program applications that ran on top of the blockchain. And the word that he used to describe this was called a smart contract. And for your listeners who aren't aware, a smart contract is basically what it sounds like. It's programming language software that mimics the logic of a contractual agreement, but with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, and where you don't have to rely on intermediaries to create trust, like lawyers and escrow agents and brokers and courts and the like. So if you think about the world of business or even financial services, every financial asset is a contract. The stock is a contract. A bond is a contract. The futures contract is a contract, entitling the bearer of that instrument to some economic benefit, right? Coupon payments and a principal or what have you. So the idea of a programmable blockchain that could be used for any kind of asset class in any industry is a pretty ambitious idea, especially coming from a 19-year-old University of Waterloo dropout with a big brain, but not a lot of experience in the real world. But Ethereum had a great following, and they raised $18 million in one of the first major ICOs. 18 million sounds like a lot, but these days it's chump change in the world of blockchain. But he launched it a year later, and today Ethereum is this global juggernaut worth $35 billion. And people often struggle with the question, why on earth is this thing worth $35 billion? And this for the simple reason that whereas Bitcoin is still confined to this one use case of moving money, Ethereum has attracted developers from all over the world from many different industries. So the developer community for Ethereum is many orders of magnitude larger than it is for Bitcoin. And I think it's fair to say that most of the best and brightest computer scientists in the world are working on this, which is pretty exciting. And then another thing is that Ethereum has become almost sort of involuntarily or not intentionally has become the foundational platform on top of which new organizations are getting built. So going back to ICOs, 75% of ICOs are tokens that are issued on top of the Ethereum blockchain. So in terms of network effects, it's what Union Square Ventures calls the FAT protocol. Basically, the protocol itself, the Ethereum protocol, because it has a denomination of value, can be traded, is going to be worth many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, because every time someone does something on top of it, it increases the value of the network itself. And it's kind of captured a lot of people's imaginations and gotten them very excited. So one example of that is the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is this huge consortium of some of the largest organizations in the world, like Microsoft and Toyota and JP Morgan, but also lots of startups as well, like Consensus Systems and Nuco and Cosmos and others. And this massive sort of multi-stakeholder organization is racing ahead with applications that can be applied to major industries. And pick an industry, and I can point to half a dozen projects in each of them. It doesn't mean they're all good, but there are developers using this technology to solve problems in energy markets, carbon trading, digital rights management, diamond trading, art tracking, financial services, you name it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk a bit about financial services, because your book mentions the Golden Eight. I know you also mentioned this in your Lendit presentation, sort of 8 ways that the financial services sector will be impacted by blockchain. Now, I don't know if we have time to delve into all of the 8, but can you at least talk us through some of these changes you see coming?
Sure. Well, we already covered one, and that one is called Fund and Invest, so how companies access growth capital. And I think ICOs are already completely revolutionizing that. The other 7, I think, are going to be equally transformed, and I'll walk through a couple of them. So I think the first one, foundational to a lot of financial services, is identity, which we call authenticating and attesting to value. And, for a bank, if they can't do KYC and AML on their customer, then that person's not going to become a customer. And doing that takes a lot of time and is very cost prohibitive. And oftentimes certain people don't have the ways to attest to their identity, and then they become part of the unbanked, the 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to identity. So with blockchain, the way it'll work in the future is that rather than individuals having to, or rather than large firms having to do their own due diligence on each individual customer, that customer will have an identity which is made up of information that everyone can trust is true because it was recorded on this immutable system. And there are real world examples of this happening today. So there's a company called Uport, which is based in New York, that is working on a sovereign identity system. Another one in San Francisco called Civic, which is itself doing a $100 million ICO, that is very far along in how it will address this issue. And even today, there was an announcement that Microsoft and Accenture are working on a similar project. So rather than the virtual you living out there on the internet as a bunch of fragments owned by intermediaries, it'll be something that you control inside a digital black box, and you decide how it's used. But it also means that the end user can trust that information is valid. And that's going to be good for a lot of reasons. It will improve privacy for the individual, but will also reduce cost and friction for companies that are looking to onboard new customers. It will mean, Civic estimates it'll mean 90% cost reduction. So that's just one small example. A couple of the other ones, there's transferring and storing value. So the moving of money and the storing of money is basically the nuts and bolts of retail banking. I think blockchain is making it pretty clear that those two aspects of the industry will probably be free utilities that companies won't be able to make money on, and so they'll have to do higher level services on top of that. And there are lots of reasons for that, but the simple one is that the transaction costs of moving money through the way the financial system works today will not exist in the future because we'll have a new digital medium for value. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll give you a couple examples. One is accounting and auditing, and this is one that I think could actually be the most profound. So today, accounting is done, with the cycles of the moon every 3 to 4 months or every year. And for accounting firm looking at the financial statements of a company, or even for an investor, you're not really seeing the whole picture. It's kind of like looking at someone dancing in front of a strobe light, which is to say you see bits and pieces and you try to make out an image of what the whole picture is. Mm-hmm. So blockchain is basically like going into the dance floor and turning all the lights on. So instead of a company recording debits and credits, they would automatically register every transaction to a distributed ledger blockchain that could be accessible by regulators, investors, auditors, and others. And it would be a real-time living, breathing picture of the financial health of a company rather than a facsimile that we see every few months. And that'll mean big changes for the audit function of the firm. It'll mean big changes for the role of the CFO. It'll certainly mean big changes for the big five, the audit firms who do make a lot of money doing this. Doesn't mean that their industry is going to change for the worse. It'll just mean that it will change. And they might have to focus on other higher value services like advisory work, investment banking work, consulting, and tax. And I think that shift is already underway. If you were to talk to anybody at PwC or EY or Deloitte or any of these companies, they'll tell you that they're preparing for this new future. So that's 4 or 5 of 8 that I think are going to be deeply and profoundly affected. And, if you're listening to this and you work in a bank and you're wondering, how do I avoid becoming obsolete? You have to change the way you think about new technology. By the way, I don't think that this means the end of intermediaries. It just means that intermediaries need to rethink their role.
Right.
So instead of just thinking opportunistically, how can a technology allow me to trim fat for my business, which is really what a lot of people are still talking about when it comes to blockchain. How can it allow me to cut clearing and settling costs out of my public equity business or something like that? Rather than just thinking opportunistically, you have to think strategically. Because if you say blockchain can allow me to cut costs for my public equity, sales and trading business, well, what does it mean if 5 years from now there is no such thing as a public equity market because all assets are traded bilaterally on distributed exchanges and there aren't clearinghouses or escrow agents or investment bankers or brokers who are needed to facilitate the exchange of financial assets? Is that a question that people are asking? And if not, it's one that they certainly should.
Right. And you certainly have. My mind's just ticking over here, thinking of all the different implications, the potential implications of this. And I think it's going to. One thing's for certain: the future is going to look very different to the past. I think we could all agree on that. So I want to talk a little bit about a lot of the big consortiums have been in the news, and I want to get your take on there's R3, which have had some banks leave, but they've raised quite a bit of money. There's Hyperledger and a newer one called Digital Asset. What is your view on, I guess, which ones of these consortiums are really going to really get traction?
Well, I can't say for sure because I don't have a seat at the table at some of these groups. What I can tell you is the fact that all these large organizations are coming together to try and figure out this technology, I think is a good thing. I do question the consortium model as a way to achieve change quickly. But if you were to look at a consortium that's got 100 different members, many of whom are in overlapping industries and many of whom compete directly with one another, and many of whom are at totally different stages of development. Certain ones are very advanced and others are new. What incentive does that create? All those things that I just mentioned. What incentives does that create to share information and share insights and cooperate? And what incentive does it create to hoard information or to not cooperate? And so, I'm cautiously optimistic that these consortia will produce something of value, but I question whether or not they'll be as effective as if these companies were to go it on their own, or to work in smaller groups where there are clear complementary interests. The counterpoint to that is that when it comes to financial technology, network effects really matter. If you're the only person in the world with a Bloomberg terminal, it's not as effective as if everybody's got a Bloomberg terminal because it's not just a way to access information, it's a communications tool. And I think that's the same for common standards around financial technology, especially blockchain. So I think it is necessary that industry participants can agree on a certain set of standards. Whether or not it's going to come out of these kinds of groups, I'm not sure. There are other groups that I think are going to be very effective. I think that the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is going to be effective because it is a very diverse group of players, banks, manufacturers, technology companies, and startups who aren't looking at industry-specific solutions so much as they are looking at basic technical standards for how to scale the Ethereum blockchain and its corresponding ecosystem. And I think that those basic technical standard conversations are the ones that need to be happening right now. And I think Hyperledger, which is a project of the Linux Foundation, is in the same boat on that front. So that's all to say that in the end, I think it's all good. Basically, I think it's all R&D, and whether or not one's more effective than the other is not of so much concern to me, because I think that eventually whatever the best technology or best solution that arises from this will become dominant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're almost out of time, but one more question I really want to get to, and this is it's around the barriers, because you've painted a world that is vastly different to the one we live in today, or certainly the one we lived in 5 years ago. So, what do you think the main barriers that may end up hampering the widespread adoption of blockchain technology?
Well, that's a question that we kept asking throughout the research for the book, and it's frankly one that I continue to ask almost every single day. And in the book, we actually came across so many of these challenges that we dedicated an entire chapter to it. It's called Showstoppers, Reasons Blockchain Might Fail. That was written a year ago. I think we're past the point of why blockchain might fail, but I think we can certainly still ask the question, what might cause blockchain to not reach its potential, or to leave this better future sort of unfulfilled, so to speak? And there are lots of reasons. There's still technical questions. Ethereum is $35 billion, but it's still a new technology. Someone described it as a $30 billion gorilla on roller skates holding a tray of champagne glasses.
That's great.
It's big and it's powerful, but shit, things could go wrong. Sorry, I shouldn't swear. Things could go wrong as it continues to scale. And those are questions that I think are really important. What will industry incumbents do? How will governments react to it? What will regulators' response be to this technology? What are the social consequences of a technology that's a big disintermediator? Does it mean job loss? Does it mean dislocation in labor markets? There are lots of reasons why the technology might not reach its potential. But you have to ask yourself, are these reasons that it's a bad idea, or are they implementation challenges to be overcome? And I think they're all implementation challenges, because we've got another kick at the can here, basically, to reinvent the economic power grid and the old order of human affairs, and maybe create a slightly more democratic financial services industry and more democratic economy. And I think that's probably good for everybody. And it's really not a question of whether or not blockchain will create that better future, because it won't. Technology is just a tool. It's not doesn't have moral agency. It's not right or wrong. It really depends on how it's wielded. So my hope is that people take it seriously and wield it responsibly.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, Alex. Much more to talk about, but I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And will I be seeing you in China?
Yes, you will. I will be there.
Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Great. Thanks, Alex. See ya.
Thanks. Take care.
Well, Alex certainly does paint a fascinating future of how blockchain can really impact the financial world. And seriously, if even some of this comes to pass, or even if it takes a lot longer than he thinks, the world is going to be a very, very different place. Particularly the financial world is going to be a very different place, and in some ways much more democratic than it is today. I sometimes feel sorry for the regulators, because the world is changing so fast, and they simply, I don't know how they're going to be able to keep up with some of this, with some of these changes, because it takes a while to craft these laws, and the legislators find it difficult to agree on just about anything. So I imagine there's going to be some challenges up ahead where that's concerned, but it's an exciting future. I think we're going to have some massive changes that are going to happen as a result of this blockchain technology. And as Alex said, he's going to be in China. He spoke at New York. There will be a link in the show notes to that at the last Lend It. He's also speaking at Lend It China in Shanghai, July 15th and 16th. And if you haven't got a ticket yet, you still can get one. Anyway, on that note, I will sign off. I very much appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.